in some ways, Winston Churchill puts John Churchill in the shade.
Yes.
I mean, it'd be interesting to look at Marlborough through the lens that isn't actually distorted by Winston Churchill.
Yeah. It's like basically Accrington and Stanley taking on Manchester United and then wondering why it lost, you know, because they are so good.
The biggest thing for me here that comes out of Blenheim is the rise of Prussia.
Yeah.
And Prussia starts to be a military power, and throughout the 18th century, up through Frederick the Great and beyond, they are a force to be reckoned with.
And you think without the Battle of Blenheim going the way it did, you don't get the rise of Prussia in the same way?
No, I don't think it does.
For much of the battle, Marlborough's covered in dust from a cannonball that strikes so close by him. I mean, had that been a few yards either way, then that's the end of him. Could Eugenie have then controlled the whole army? I doubt it.
It's the year 1704, and Europe is in the midst of an epic struggle over the Spanish throne and the continent's balance of power. The War of Spanish Succession. Louis XIV sought to unite the crowns of France and Spain, but the Grand Alliance of England, the Dutch Republic and Austria were determined to keep the House of Habsburg on the Spanish throne. The Franco-Bavarian army planned to seize Vienna, the Habsburg capital, but the Grand Alliance couldn't let that happen. And so, on the 13th of August, a village in the Bavarian countryside would play host to a battle that would help shape the future of Europe for years to come. The Battle of Blenheim. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Blenheim, the culmination of the long march of the Danube, and a victory which enshrined the Duke of Marlborough's name into British history. Yet say the Grand Alliance had lost that day, would the War of Spanish Succession and the future of Europe look very different indeed? That's a question for our experts, and joining me as ever is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and the military historian Andrew Robertshaw. Welcome to you both. Okay, now we have a big map in front of us here showing continental Europe as it would have been at the beginning of the 18th century. Chris, I suppose to start with you, can you set the scene for us and talk a little bit about the War of Spanish Succession, which this of course is a famous battle of. What is that all about, and what are the alliances that have formed as a result?
Certainly. Well, France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, has been the preeminent military power on the continent of Europe since the end of the 30 Years' War, for about 60 years, in fact. And his armies have been universally successful. In the 1690s, you've had a war called the War of the League of Augsburg. It's where quite a lot of the countries of Europe have combined to actually stop France extending its boundaries to the Rhine. And there's been a lot of battles been going on the border between the Spanish Netherlands, which is roughly Belgium today, and the Dutch Republic as well. There's a lot of very, very well fortified towns and cities there. What brings the War of Spanish Succession about is the fact that the ailing Charles II of Spain has two sisters, and each of them is married to Louis XIV and the other one to Leopold I of Austria. And initially, the deal is that what's going to happen is that the possessions that Spain has in Europe are going to be divided up when Charles II dies, and nobody's going to be able to dominate the continent in that sense. Now, the basic problem is that as he's dying, Charles II says, you know what, I think I'd like my grandson, Philip of Anjou, to be my successor.
And he's the grandson of Louis.
Yes, he is, and so it throws everything into sort of disorder at that point. However, Britain, in particular, says, "Okay, we'll go along with that." Then Louis does something very interesting. He recognises Charles Stuart, of course, who's the son of the Stuarts, who's been thrown out of Britain in 1685. And that immediately allows William III to say, right, we need to raise taxes, 4 shillings in the pound, and we need to raise armies to combat Louis XIV's ambitions. And what happens eventually is that Britain is able to forge an alliance essentially with the Habsburg monarchy. Remember Leopold I, he's the disappointed partner in this relationship. The Dutch Republic and the nascent kingdom of Prussia and a number of other states in Germany. And remember,
This is the Grand Alliance.
Yeah.
the Grand Alliance. But remember, Germany at this time is the Holy Roman Empire. So it's about 100 states of differing sizes and powers. You've got Hanover, and we've got to remember that Hanover at that time is Protestant, along with the Dutch Republic and Britain, and France is Catholic. Habsburg is a Catholic as well, of course. The really interesting one that is relevant to what happens as a result of the War of Spanish Succession is the Kingdom of Prussia. That basically is a rising power. It's a military power. The only asset it's got is its military. And that then plays a huge part in this. And by the start of the 18th century, you've got this coalition coming together to contain Louis. Louis is starting to be very belligerent. There are a series of campaigns in 1703, both on the Rhine and the Moselle and in the Spanish Netherlands, Dutch Republic. And we then get to a situation where Louis XIV says, I think we need to take out Leopold in his capital in Vienna. And that is the genesis of the 1704 campaign and why it's so necessary for Marlborough to go down to the Danube.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, let's bring you in.
Yeah.
Welcome to History Undone, first of all. Great to have you on the channel. So the Battle of Blenheim, of course, takes place in 1704. The War of Spanish Succession has started in 1701. So what happens in those early years of the war? Who's doing the best?
The French are doing the best. I mean, there are a series of battles and sieges, and it's worth saying that at this period, the outcome of a siege is something that's almost predictable. You can work out what's going to happen. A battle is you're literally throwing dice in the air. The difference being, of course, for the French, with their cavalry and their infantry and their vast armies, and also their unbeaten record, is that you're going in, it's like basically Accrington Stanley taking on Manchester United and then wondering why it lost, because they are so good. So there are some minor reverses for the French, but on the whole, it looks very much in favour of the French. Something needs to be done, particularly with Vienna under threat, because the whole balance in Europe will change irrevocably if Vienna falls.
It's worth pointing out what happened after Austerlitz, when Napoleon defeated the Austrians. It enabled Napoleon to dominate the continent, and that essentially is what is going to happen if Louis wins.
This is what they're worried about. They don't want any one power dominating Europe.
And also, opposite here, of course, Belgium, Spanish Netherlands has always been a neurosis for this country. But more particularly, you're looking at basically an early prequel to Napoleon's conquest of the Holy Roman Empire and also Austria-Hungary as well.
Yeah. So we get to 1704. The Duke of Marlborough is this famed English commander.
Not yet.
No.
Not even by 1704?
No, I mean, he served very, very well at Sedgemoor, no problem. Changed his side subsequently, ditches his allegiance to James II of England, who then is defeated at the Boyne. His reputation is relatively good. His men like him. He's a popular commander, but he's got no great military reputation. I mean, Marshal Tallard, a different matter entirely.
Yeah.
Superb reputation. Everybody was worried about facing him, but Marlborough's reputation would come from Blenheim.
Andrew,
well, that's very interesting,
it's worth mentioning, Andrew, how politically connected he is.
Yes, oh yes.
I mean, he's a courtier. He's very well in with the establishment in that sense.
Yeah, and of course, obviously, he has a great friend who actually is in charge of the Treasury, Sidney Godolphin. He's a political animal. He's working as a commander. He's the Captain General, yes, but he's also then got links to court as well, because Sarah is actually at court with Queen Anne, which is criticised, even at the time.
OK, now before we get into the battle itself, we should talk about the incredible feat of the march to the Danube, which takes place under the Duke of Marlborough's amazing logistical command. And this is a 5-week-long, 250-mile march from, well, basically the Spanish Netherlands down to the Danube. So talk us through what happens there, Andrew.
I mean, the situation is really that when Marlborough becomes Captain General, the British Army has got a pretty poor reputation. I mean, compared to the Dutch soldiers that arrived in London with William III, we've not done very well. Partly because they're underfunded, partly because of basically political machinations. He comes in and he's able to secure funding to ensure that he can pay the men. More importantly, he can pay for food. He's not going to try and live off the country. The French do that a lot, and it obviously upsets the locals no end when your crops go and your animals go. We're also going to build a series of magazines en route, not just for ammunition, but also for things like rye flour to make bread, to move bricks so you can build brick ovens, and then the men could then march for 3 or 4 days, stop, rest, and move on. Even, would you believe, dumping ahead of the army boots or shoes so when the men arrive, they're not, footsore, and ensuring that you've got enough forage. For every 3 soldiers, there are 2 horses, and they have to be fed. And he organises all of it, and all the heavy equipment is moved down the Rhine, and he moves quickly, and he moves in a way that the enemy really don't know how far and how fast he's going, and particularly where he's going to end up.
And that's a key point, because the French are guessing throughout this, Chris, and they're having to go back to Louis for their orders as to, well, can we follow Marlborough?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we've got to bear in mind here is that the Allies are quite vulnerable here in the Netherlands. You've got Villeroy here with 40,000 troops, and it takes quite a lot for Marlborough to convince Heinsius, who's the pensionary general, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, actually that he's going to go down here. And he says, look, I can get back in pretty fast time. I can come down the Rhine by barge if I have to. And the Dutch say, OK, look, you leave Overkerk here with some of our troops and you go off, but come back if we really come under threat. Now, initially, Marlborough heads towards the River Moselle, which is a point of vulnerability for the French. They recognise that. Look, there's Verdun there. You can see what the significance is there. And so if he attacks France through there, and he certainly threatens to do that, and all the time, Marlborough is sending out letters and notices in public that he's going to do that. And he wants them to be intercepted. So the French are going, oh, he's going for the Moselle. He gets to Koblenz. They're even more convinced he's going down the Moselle until he sets out for the Mainz here. And they're still thinking, is he going to double back? And all the time, his intelligence is really good. He's picking up quite a lot of stuff en route. He's sending out deceptive messages. He's also getting his troops up at 2 o'clock in the morning. They're on the march by 3. By midday, they've camped and are resting. So moving by night, of course, is concealing what he's doing. And it's known as a scarlet caterpillar moving through the countryside here. And Andrew's absolutely right. His logistics stocks are incredible. He gets the local communities to put stocks of food on the way. And, he's got as Andrew said, he's got 22,000 horses. The draft animals, the cavalry, and those pulling the artillery. They consume 100 tons of oats a day. That's the scale of it that he's managed to achieve down here. So in terms of logistics, he's done a fantastic job. He's deceiving the enemy as to where he's going. And all the while, of course, the French are thinking, we've got to get this army of Marshal Tallard to basically join with Marshal Marsin and the Elector of Bavaria so we can get going down here. It's only when he gets here towards Heidelberg that the French actually realise what Marlborough's up to and the forces he's got. At this point, they send a message back to Louis saying, can we go after him? And they wait until the message comes back that that's approved. And because of that, Marlborough's able to slip ahead of them, join with the Marquis of Baden, who's a leading German prince, and they proceed down towards the Danube and on to Donauwörth.
And there's another name on this map we should probably mention because he's key when we come on to the battle itself. Eugene of Savoy. Now, who is he?
Eugene of Savoy basically offers his services to Louis XIV, and he's turned down. He's told he's not suitable. He's probably better off being a clergyman. And he then goes to work basically for the Dutch. And he's a very, very experienced general. I mean, he hasn't got the authority or the control of Marlborough, but he actually has more combat experience. And the two of them, luckily, don't fight like two cats in a bag. When they meet, they agree how they're going to proceed. It's actually the two men together that make the difference.
They get on really well. I mean, it's almost an automatic relationship. The one they don't get on with is the Marquis of Baden, who obviously is in his own home patch. What's really interesting is that Eugene comes and says, we the Grand Alliance, we fought here last year,
Yeah.
and we got absolutely hammered at Hochstadt. And Hochstadt is the town just behind Blenheim.
Yeah.
So Eugene knows the territory really well, and so do most of his officers.
And is it Marlborough and Eugene's plan to always fight at Blenheim or Blenheim to give it its German name?
No, basically, they're essentially getting onto the Danube here. They want to capture Donauwörth here as a base here for logistics. They've also got a get-out clause at Nordlingen, which is to the northwest here, which is a base. And essentially, once they've taken Donauwörth, Tallard actually thinks they're going to withdraw back to Nordlingen again. Yeah. So he's not really ready to take on the Allies here. But what they do is they go south of the Danube here, they capture Donauwörth and a fairly substantial fortress there. That's a good base for them. At this point, they really want to draw the French onto them, because this is where they want to fight. And so what they do is they start devastating Bavaria. And the Elector, of course, is seeing his towns and his villages being destroyed. Over 352 villages and towns destroyed by the Allies. And Marlborough says, I really don't like doing this, but it's the only way that I can actually bring them onto us. And that's exactly what it does. Now, the other interesting thing, and any soldier will tell you this looking at the terrain, you've got a distinct advantage if you're fighting from the east in this space here. You've got all sorts of problems in terms of the foothills of the Jura Hills. You've got forests and other things. You cannot deploy as you want to if you're coming from the west. So they've actually almost selected where they want to fight. It's in this area here. And so they're drawing the French onto them. You've got the Elector of Bavaria actually fanned out, trying to stop all this devastation. He's got foraging parties out. Tallard is coming on with his army. They're going to join up, as I said, with Marsan and the Elector of Bavaria, and they're going to rub out this intrusion onto the Danube. And that's the plan.
Well, there we go. That's how we ended up with this conflagration at Blenheim. Let's focus now on the Battle of Blenheim itself. OK, so the march has culminated, and now we can move on to the battle itself. Just before we get into the battle, let's just run through some of the key statistics. The Grand Alliance had around 56,000 troops, with 51 infantry battalions, 92 cavalry squadrons, and around 66 guns available. Their total casualties stood at around 12,000, with 4,500 killed and 7,500 wounded. The Franco-Bavarian army, meanwhile, actually had slightly stronger numbers, with approximately 60,000 troops, with 69 infantry battalions, 128 cavalry squadrons, and 90 guns. Estimated casualties for them range between 20 and 30,000. This was made up of 8,000 killed, 7,000 wounded, and 14,000 captured, including their leader, Marshal Tallard. So let's talk about the Battle of Blenheim. We've got a new map in front of us now showing the lie of the land. And one thing to mention, first of all, of course, you've got Hochstadt here, which is what Europeans know the Battle of Blenheim as. We call it the Battle of Blenheim, even though, of course, it's really Blenheim, not Blenheim. They know it as the Battle of Hochstadt. Let's talk, Chris, first of all, about Marlborough moving in this direction. So what happens to kind of prompt this engagement?
So his scouts have already indicated what's happening with the French and Bavarian army coming on, as you can see now. They have been back at Donauwörth here. And what they've done is they've sent the Marquis of Baden off with 15,000 troops to go and take Ingolstadt, which is the next major city on the Danube. That's in order to actually have something to fall back on, just in case it goes wrong. Baden thinks it's to keep him out of things. That's probably not the case. It's actually very good tactical reasons for doing that. Okay, but as they hear Tallard and Marsan and the Elector coming on here, they deploy the previous day and overnight. Remember, Marlborough moves by night. And so about 2 in the morning, they start forward and they want to be able to get across the Nebel. They realise they can't do that. And so what they do is they say, right, what's going on the other side of the river? And they realise that what Tallard has done is fortified these villages here. Oberglau, Blenheim itself, and in the north here with the Elector of Bavaria, Lutzingen. Now this is a pattern of how they did it in the Spanish Netherlands. And so this is basically a tactic that's come from how the French fight in the north. And so the problem that Marlborough and Eugene have got is to be able to deploy in time, not be attacked, of course, themselves as they're deploying in column here, but also be able to balance the forces that they know are superior. Now, the Earl of Orkney, who's one of Marlborough's junior commander says, don't like this, we've got to get across a river. Yeah. They're actually on rising ground here.
Well, the Franco-Bavarian army are in a good position, aren't they? They've got the Danube, they've got the Nebel, they've got higher ground.
Yeah. And they've got a lot of cannon, and as you say, their flanks are covered by these foothills here, and they're anchored on the Danube here. So a lot of them, led by the Earl of Orkney, say this is not great. No. And Marlborough says, no, I have a plan, and Prince Eugene agrees with me, and that's what we're going to do. And what he plans to do, very briefly, is fix, and that's the expression he used in land warfare, as many French troops as he can by focusing on Blenheim itself, which has been fortified. At the same time, getting Eugene to go and put pressure on the Elector and this fortified village of Lutzingen here. And what he's hoping is going to happen is that Tallard is going to deplete his forces in the centre to reinforce them, and then he's going to strike through the middle.
And Andrew, does Tallard fall into Marlborough's trap?
He does. Well, in fact, what happens to his Tallard's subordinates suggest actually disputing the crossing of the Nebel stream. That would have been very, very difficult. But he's convinced that if he lets them come across the Nebel stream, uses his cavalry, and most of his cavalry are in the centre, which is unusual. As a layout, they're actually going to simply crush the enemy as they come across. They'll have their back to a stream. This will be decisive. So he says, no, we'll let them come across. We'll give them time. So they are slow to deploy in some ways, but also they actually play into Marlborough's plan and Eugene's plan.
The interesting thing is there's a formation that Marlborough's introduced here, which is, I think, unique up to this point. What he does is he puts a line of infantry across first in order to take the ground. He then gets that to screen 2 lines of cavalry to come across, and then there's another line of infantry behind. I've never seen this before, and it works brilliantly. And as Andrew says, quite a lot of, in fact, Marsan and the Elector are saying to Tallard, we really need to force forward here. By allowing that basically unique formation to come across, he is able to survive and also then to press on and defend his cavalry against this mass cavalry here. But the key issue is the battle starts essentially by the infantry here under Lieutenant General John Cutts, basically putting pressure on Blenheim itself. And the Marquis of Clerambault is actually surprised in his bed by his valet. He said, why are you waking me so early? And the valet says, well, the English are here. And that is exactly what's happened, because they've got up early. They're here well before the French are able to get to their fortifications and also to their horses as well. So they're already pressing. Now, all Marlborough wants is for Cutts to put pressure on Blenheim. And Clerambault falls for it and says, look, I need reinforcing. And Tallard reluctantly sends troops across. Later on, he asks for more. Tallard says, no way am I depleting my centre anymore. He takes them anyway. and so this becomes a honey trap for the French here. Meanwhile, as Churchill's brother, who's in charge of the infantry here, is taking everybody across with the cavalry, Eugene is trying to deploy round here. And none of this starts in the centre or this side until Eugene is able to deploy round here around 12 o'clock. So it's quite later. So already, we're pressing on Blenheim here, but actually most of the army isn't deployed until about midday.
And Andrew, should Tallard not have been kind of wise to Marlborough's surprise tactics by this point? I mean, surely you go, well, look, he's already kind of deceived us essentially once with the March to the Danube. We should expect the unexpected.
Well, I think the point is that the Tallard and the others are all so used to winning. It seems very unlikely that, although Marlborough's being very clever, it's just showing off.
Well, they haven't lost a battle for how long?
Well, 60 years,
60
basically.
years.
Oh, not a big one, anyway. And the key thing is, as well, is that the Marlborough's men are also using some new tactics. The French are still firing in 4 ranks, which is quite difficult to do. Then they all reload at once. The British battalions are now firing by platoons. That basically means that for every company, you've got them divided up into groups of about 40, and then you've got a series of what are called firings, which means that each of those firings is firing every 20 seconds. So you don't have a big bang and then we've got to all reload at once. The firing ripples along the front all the time. You can't actually get close with your cavalry because they're going to get shot up. And oddly, one of the things that's going back to the days of the Civil War and Cromwell's men is whereas basically Tallard's cavalry are going in with the pistol and then reluctantly drawing their swords, Allied soldiers, horsemen, going in with the sword, and in fact he only gives each of his troopers 3 shots with their pistol, so they won't use them. Okay, which means actually that the French stand and then are amazed that we just go in, basically shock tactics, something that they weren't expecting.
It's worth bearing in mind that the flanks are having a hard time of it here.
Yes.
They're not getting into Blenheim at all. Similarly, Eugene on this side is having a really tough time of it. He's not penetrating here. And in effect, what is happening is they're being held and they're losing quite a lot. And at one stage, Eugene's troops look as if they're going to turn and run away. And Eugene stands amongst them and says, I want to die amongst brave men, not amongst cowards.
Yes.
And he gets the Danes in and some of the German troops to actually stem the flow. And he's able to do that. And at this critical stage, when you've got a situation in the centre where the French have actually depleted their centre to reinforce their flanks, you've got a situation here where you've got a 2-to-1 advantage.
Yeah.
So essentially what happens is the British break through here, but not before Marlborough has had to actually say to Eugene, I really do need you to send some Germans to come and help me, some German cavalry, because we're actually hard put here. Because even despite our advantage here, we've got a lot of cavalry that are messing us up.
Yes.
There's also a very large French gun battery that's causing a bit of a problem as well. But the key point here is Marlborough's not only done the direction of the battle, he is in amongst his men, actually directing the tactical movement. So he's able to call on Eugene and say, I need it. And Eugene says, I really can't spare it, but I'll send them.
Yes.
I trust you. And that basic dynamic leadership in the centre here is able to bring in resources and basically concentrate firepower, as Andrew says, and they're able to overwhelm the French in the centre. And at this point, the French start to run. And you've got a situation where Marsan and the Elector say, we see the way this is going, and they start departing out to the east. Still leaves Blenheim here, no question about that. But what you've got, of course, is an encircling action. Tallard himself is injured and captured at this point. And you've then got basically a siege of Blenheim. And essentially, you see the French cavalry, 3,000, trying to escape down into this sort of bend here. They're drowned in the Danube. It's flowing at 10 knots. So you've got a huge flowing river here. They get away, they don't get away. And at the end of the day, what happens is there's a negotiated surrender of 10,000 troops in Blenheim.
I mean, the battle goes on into the dark, and it's only because actually the decision is taken. Look, we're not actually doing very well here. Although they're surrounded, they're still fighting back. To sound a parley, basically, let's discuss this. And the commander on the ground so basically goes, well, I better surrender. You know, and that means that those 10,000 men literally go, term of the Second World War, go into the bag.
I mean, Clerambault himself tries to escape and drowns. But it's probably just as well, because he probably is the critical factor in this battle, because he sucks away the resources from the centre that essentially Tallard needs to resist what's coming through the centre here.
And Andrew, just as a final thought on the battle, I suppose what needs to be stressed is how significant a victory this was for England in particular, and of course for the Duke of Marlborough, who then goes down in legend really in British military history. He goes back to England, has an amazing reception, and this is probably what England's greatest military victory since Agincourt?
Since Agincourt, and there's a massive parade through London of captured colours. All of this stuff is brought back as a demonstration, and it might seem a little odd to bring back kettle drums and to bring back trumpets, but the way that you reorganise an army following a battle or during a battle is the colours are where you rally. That's where your men know where the commander is, and you give orders using musical instruments. So if you've basically taken the colours, you've taken away the trumpets, you've taken away the bugles, you've taken away the drums, command and control doesn't exist. It's a pure way of demonstrating we have completely defeated them. And it is worth saying, by the way, that at the time, if you lost your colours, you weren't allowed to have any more until you fought a successful battle. So it's complete humiliation.
Well, there we go. That's the real history of what happened at the Battle of Blenheim. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, let's ask ourselves now, could the Battle of Blenheim have played out differently? Could, indeed, Marlborough have lost the Battle of Blenheim? Andrew, I'll start with you on this one. I mean, I suppose, first of all, you know, what could Tallard have done differently? There's surely an element of complacency here.
There is.
And they should have wised up to the fact that the Duke of Marlborough is a very canny operator.
Absolutely. I mean, he is a very good night owl, you know, doing what he does. The thing, I suppose, would be basically a fractured command. Tallard, you know, is basically undermined by one of his subordinates. But had he actually made them fight on the Nebel stream to get across, they would have struggled. Had he perhaps been earlier moving, then possibly it would have got a lot worse for them. And in that case, actually, it could be that Marlborough's forced to retreat. It is worth saying that on the right flank, one thing that contributes to the defeat of the Battle of Blenheim is there are so many men in there, they can't even fire. They're just standing around. They can't take orders, they can't do anything. So again, one thought would have been to come out of the village, but it means leaving your fortifications. But if that will blunt the enemy, then that's what you've got to do. But they don't. They simply stand. They just basically do something, and they're very, very unresponsive to what's going on.
Chris, I'm going to reincarnate you as Marshal Tallard.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you do differently?
Okay, well, first of all, you know, I'd like to use my initiative. So had I been able to do what I wanted to do, I'd have been much further forward anyway. Yeah. Wouldn't have to refer back to Louis XIV. If I'm Tallard and I want to win this battle, I've got to get as far east as I can. I would want to be across the Nebel. Yeah. And in fact, if you look at their front, it's about, you know, 3.5 miles across here. I'd actually wanted to get it narrower, to tell you the truth, and squeeze the British and the Allies in here. I think the reason why he stayed there is because he saw the advantage of fortifying these three villages. If you look at them at the time, they're much larger villages than those on this side, for example. And in fact, if you look at the ground, you've got very narrow bits. You can't deploy troops here. But if you're this side of the river, I doubt if the British and the Allies would have offered battle on that basis. So all he's got to do to win is not lose.
Yes.
Do you think Tallard overestimated the Nebel as a kind of difficult to cross obstacle almost? Because it's marshy, but it is a stream.
Yeah, and they hadn't done the reconnaissance, whereas the Allies had done the reconnaissance the night before. There's a very famous Dutch officer that Marlborough uses, and you know, at the real risk to his life here, he actually does a reconnaissance along here, and he says it's good country for cavalry. We can do this. And I think that's the problem. The other problem for Tallard and the Elector and Marsan is their logistics isn't good enough to sustain them there for long. So remember that what we said earlier, Nordlingen up to the northwest here is where the Allies can actually get quite a lot of supplies from. They don't have that luxury. So
I think they're down to 6 days' supply at that point. So they can't even stay there very long.
Can't hang around. And remember, the Allies are taking all sorts of fortresses along here. They're devastating Bavaria. So he's got to bring on a battle somehow. So there's an element of saying, I need to be able to suck them across the river and actually come on to me. And he's quite confident, as Andrew said earlier, of actually dealing with that. I mean, you know, typical French logistics, they have a brothel of 36 prostitutes in their baggage train. So you can see where the French priorities are on this campaign. But essentially, all Tallard has to do, you know, to win is not lose. That's the point. But he's committed, obviously, to actually face off against this substantial army. There's no question about that. And of course, he's got the Elector of Bavaria saying, look, my electorate's being totally devastated by this lot. If we withdraw now, then you know, they're going to be back on the loose again. And you know, and this is an ally you've just taken on. You don't want to lose him.
Andrew, a good general's a lucky general.
Yes.
How lucky does Marlborough get?
I think it's a combination of luck and guile. A very good understanding of logistics, because obviously, you know, amateurs study war, real generals study logistics. He's very good at that. I mean, Tallard's army is exhausted by the time it's got there. Some of their men have actually been killed as they come through the Black Forest by, effectively, a guerrilla campaign to stop them from coming through.
Yeah, I mean, they lost thousands.
They lost thousands. So they're already having a very rough time. And Marlborough's got it all going his way, you know. And frankly, he is able to get Tallard to just remain pretty impassive, which is what he wanted.
He maintains the initiative. That's the key point. And that's what you need to be able to do. And even when things are in the balance, he's in the thick of the action. This is the key thing about Marlborough. He's actually in amongst it all, saying, right, we need something here. Plug that gap. Let's move forward. Napoleon's the same in that sense. Yes. Moving around the battle. Mustn't forget, there are 3 other battles after this that Marlborough wins. Yeah. And Ramillies and Oudenarde are almost exactly the same in terms of the way he actually sort of shows his enemy one thing and attacks somewhere else. Matplaquet is not quite so successful. No. It's a draw battle against a very talented French general. Yeah. There's no question about that.
It is also worth saying that for much of the battle, Marlborough's covered in dust from a cannonball that strikes so close by him. I mean, had that been a few yards either way, then that's the end of him. Could Eugenia have then controlled the whole army? I doubt it.
Well, that's a really interesting what if.
I mean, Eugene's pretty hard pressed here to the north. I mean, you know, both these flanks aren't actually prevailing until the battle is lost and the Elector and Marsan disappear in pretty good order as well. So, you know, it very much relies on them holding there so that Marlborough and his brother can get across the middle here.
But there's certainly a scenario in which, had Marshal Tallard played things differently, the Franco-Bavarian army win here.
Yeah, I mean, if they're further forward, there's no question about that. That you know, you probably don't even offer battle on that basis.
No. And in which case, then the army under Marlborough has to go back to the Low Countries.
Wow. I mean, the other thing that, in terms of the campaign rather than the battle itself, better coordination between what's going on in the Spanish Netherlands. You know, Villeroy attacks Overkerk on the border between the Spanish Netherlands and Netherlands, means that Marlborough has to go back.
Yes.
That's what he said will happen.
Now we're getting into some really interesting long-term consequences of what happens if the Battle of Blenheim is lost by Marlborough. So, on that note, let's zoom out and let's discuss those. OK, so let's look at the situation more broadly in terms of the War of Spanish Succession and what the impact would have been had the Battle of Blenheim been lost by the Grand Alliance. Chris, to start with you, what does that mean for the rest of the war?
Well, it's game over because at that point you reinforce Tallard's army. It marches on Vienna. You've already brushed aside quite a lot of the imperial troops at Blenheim, which are allied with Marlborough. You've got Vendôme coming up from Italy. You've got a major Hungarian revolt, which is now obviously energised by the fact that Marlborough has lost at Blenheim. You're probably going to get Villeroy pressing on to Overkerk in the Netherlands because they've removed the threat from down here. And also all the French troops that are guarding the Moselle and Rhine valleys, they're available too. So at this point, it's looking very bad for the Grand Alliance. So
the very thing that the Grand Alliance is worried about, which is essentially Louis dominating Europe, is probably comes to pass.
Yeah, the only upside, of course, is the British captured Gibraltar as part of this in 1704. And as it happens, you know, all the things that lead to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, where in fact, you know, Louis gets his way in Spain. But for the rest of it, you've got a situation where Savoy gets Sicily. You see Austria getting parts of Milan, Naples as well. And the really important thing that comes out of the War of Spanish Succession is that Prussia starts to grow in terms of being a kingdom. And Prussia, of course, eventually becomes this great military power at the end of the Napoleonic period, and then becomes obviously the absolute engine for driving Germany together for the Franco-Prussian War.
And Andrew, do you agree that Vienna would have fallen?
Oh yes, I think under those circumstances, there's no question about it. And you have to remember here that if it all goes very badly wrong, the British way of warfare is that the Royal Navy will deliver the army to where it's wanted. And if it goes wrong, it'll go and collect them. You know, that's the way, whether that's Corunna, whether that's Gallipoli, whether it's Dunkirk. So that there would have been a possible situation in which we are driven out of continental Europe. rescued by the Navy. I mean, the Navy can then go off and pick off bits of other people's empires, because we always do that. But we're really only able to work as part of a coalition. If the coalition collapses, we're basically back on our island, and that's it.
The worry is, what happens to the Dutch Republic?
Correct.
Now, there's one scenario, of course, where we do get back on the continent.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is on the death of Queen Anne,
Yeah.
Who takes over as George I, the Elector of Hanover.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he becomes George I. We're now back in the continent of Europe. And of course, that determines quite a lot of our policy in the 18th century, because our kings are actually the Electors of Hanover as well.
Yes.
And so they've got something to play there. But if it's already under French domination, do we actually even consider George I as the King of England?
I mean, that is fascinating. So do you think the Dutch Republic would have fallen, Chris?
No, I don't actually. I think that they probably would have come to terms, but they would have been under severe pressure. I mean, you remember Napoleon basically made it into the Republic of Batavia and dominated it. I mean, the way the French are operating at this time at strategic levels, you can't actually see them not doing essentially what Napoleon did.
Yeah.
That is dominating the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg monarchy. Prussia's looking very dodgy at that stage, and Hanover as well. So the French Empire, if you like, would include Spain, Holy Roman Empire, and quite a lot of this here. It's Charlemagne. And in fact, it's mentioned many times under Louis XIV. We're going to recreate the empire of Charlemagne.
And Andrew, if Habsburg Austria is essentially crumbling and falling apart, I just wonder, do the Ottoman Empire think, we might be tempted?
I can see no reason why not, because frankly, their intention is to be expansionist, and if anything that weakens then Austro-Hungary has to be worth exploiting.
And remember, the Turks tried to capture Vienna in 1683.
Yes.
So if France achieves what the Turks couldn't, you're right. The Turks are going to go, this is very interesting for us.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another interesting entity here. Look, the Poland-Lithuania.
Yeah.
So if you've got this bit dominated by France, this suddenly becomes a very interesting state here.
How far do you think the Ottomans would have gone? I mean, let's say they think, OK, we fancy taking a bit out of the Habsburg Empire. I mean, how far do they push?
Well, they can push as far as they like, I would suspect, until they come up against the French if they're actually dominating it here. Remember, this part of Hungary has only just been liberated from the Ottomans anyway.
Yes.
It was part of the Ottoman Empire. The reason for the revolt is the nobility in Hungary just don't fancy how repressive the Austrian monarchy is. No. They're taxing them, they're getting people for the army and things like that. And they're thinking, hang on, just a minute. We thought we were being liberated here.
Yes.
In fact, it's more oppressive than it was under the Ottomans. So that's why the revolt is happening. So the Ottomans are going to see a real fertile field for getting mixed up here. Probably not with an invasion, but actually trying to reassert their authority over that region.
Yeah. OK, so we're saying if the Battle of Blenheim is lost by Marlborough in 1704, the War of Spanish Succession probably comes to an end very soon after, and it's a pretty decisive French victory.
Yeah.
In which case, I mean, in real life, of course, you then get a kind of settlement at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, essentially. And that means that, I mean, you could argue it's a kind of victory in the end for France, but you end up with a settlement whereby Britain gets certain territories in the Americas and new trade arrangements and whatever. Do those settlements still happen? Presumably they don't, and so therefore Britain don't get access to the Americas.
No, absolutely. I mean, we probably would take advantage of everyone's focus on Europe in exactly the same way as Chris mentioned. When the Dutch basically concede to Napoleon, we simply go off down to South Africa and take Cape Town, because we can do. But it's not going to be a major change for anybody in Europe. It helps us to trade, but that's it. We are simply picking off little bits of other people's empires, but this is going to be quite a monolith.
Yeah. Just on the Americas, Chris, do you think that could have some significant long-term impact if you've got more Franco-Spanish influence in the Americas and less English influence?
Well, I think in South America it's quite interesting because obviously you've got quite a lot of Spanish colonies there. You've got Mexico and things like that. I think Britain continues to develop in North America. There's no question that it's very strong.
Yeah.
There's a lot of migration. There's a lot of royal charters associated with developing that. I mean, essentially, Britain at this stage says, look, our empire is the sea. There's no question about that. And Andrew's right. You then turn your attention to a much more globalist empire. I mean, one of the reasons we wanted South Africa is if we lose control of the Mediterranean, then we need to be able to trade down past the Cape and into the Indian Ocean and things like that. And so Britain's focus goes totally different at this stage. I think Britain also looks to the Nordic countries and says, look, if that's dominated by France, we need to cultivate neutral Sweden. Obviously Denmark, if it still survives under a French aegis. And, we look at the Baltic as being where we operate in Europe.
I mean, there always had been a continental policies by one party and the other one actually being a maritime policy. All that happens then is that the continental policy, forget that one, not strategy. We're going to now go for the maritime one. And as again, it becomes one in which we actually use our dominant navy to do as much as we can away from the mainland of Europe.
I mean, just a little bit of qualification on that. Of course, we're not the great navy we are under Nelson at this point.
No.
We've had a good navy under the Commonwealth. It got very badly trashed under Charles II before Pepys got reforms in. It's won a couple of battles in the War of the League of Augsburg in the 1690s, but it is nowhere near as dominant as it becomes in the 7 Years' War. Of course, later in the century, 1756 to 63. So at this point, you've got to worry about the fact that France becomes a very, very powerful maritime power as well, because it's got the building capacity, it's got access to all the raw materials. It's not only dominant on land, it can be dominant at sea as well. And this is like China today. It's a dominant land power. It's projecting out to sea now, of course, because it can build ships and things like that. So what I'm saying here is we mustn't take for granted that Britain was going to actually succeed at sea. The French could have outbuilt us,
gone on to be the dominant naval power.
Absolutely, and dominating Italy as well. You've got the Italian Republic, so Genoa and places like that. They're full of sailors.
Well, here's an interesting one. Looking towards the end of the century, of course, this is all taking place at the beginning of the 18th century. If France is able to be much richer, much more dominant throughout the 18th century as a result of the Battle of Blenheim going differently, do you get the circumstances that lead to the French Revolution? Because, of course, France was basically bankrupt at the end of the 18th century. If this scenario plays out, presumably that isn't the case.
Well, I mean, as you know, Hitler's policy was, when he came to power, was Lebensraum, living space. The French have a vast amount of living space, and it makes a big difference to their economy and their future. Whether then nascent nationalism would then lead to problems further on, well, it's going to happen, but that would make a big difference.
Chris, do you have a view on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, I think there are certain entities here that are never going to lie down. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is not going to lie down against French domination. And Hanover, Saxony, Prussia, very difficult to keep them, I think, within some sort of control. And that's what happens under Napoleon, of course, with the entry of the Russians. Russians aren't going to come in at this stage. There's no question about that. I mean, the biggest thing for me here that comes out of Blenheim is the rise of Prussia. And Prussia starts to be a military power. And throughout the 18th century, up through Frederick the Great and beyond, they are a force to be reckoned with.
And you think without the Battle of Blenheim going the way it did, you don't get the rise of Prussia in the same way?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, because they don't get involved, they're isolated, as you can see here with the Republic, and they're not able, I think, to assert any influence on what is going on. And the other thing is, Britain is going to be very wary again of grand alliances on the continent. It's cost them a shed load of money. That's the first thing. And secondly, what have we got out of it? The other thing is, I don't think we would have held on to Gibraltar.
No.
One thing we probably just should mention to tie things off, Andrew, is, of course, the Duke of Marlborough becomes a national hero as a result of this. He's gifted Blenheim Palace and all of that. And who is born in Blenheim Palace?
Well, Charles
Centuries later, Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill's born there, absolutely. And then obviously he writes the definitive history of the campaign, which is quoted earlier on, absolutely. He has a very illustrious forebear.
I mean, in some ways, Winston Churchill puts John Churchill in the shade. I mean, it'd be interesting to look at Marlborough through the lens that isn't actually distorted by Winston Churchill. And I find looking at his letters, looking at his correspondence and everything else, gives you a totally different character to the one that Churchill himself actually applauds and lauds. So it's interesting having a world-class figure actually is the lens through which you look at the historic figure.
Absolutely. And I think the thing about Marlborough, it has to be that he realised that what mattered was the fighting capacity of his individual soldiers. He valued them. Whether you'd asked Napoleon or Tallard, what matters in giving us a victory, they would have said something self-effacing like, moi. Me, whereas later on, the Duke of Wellington, when he was asked on what depends victory, he pointed at a poor soldier in a park in Brussels and he said, on that article there. Now, there's no love lost there, but he realises that, and Marlborough did the same.
Well, look, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think what we can say is that, yes, the Battle of Blenheim certainly could have played out differently. Had Marshal Tallard deployed different tactics, had maybe the luck not been on the Duke of Marlborough's side, it could have gone very differently. And had that happened, not only would the War of Spanish Succession almost certainly have been lost by the Grand Alliance, pretty much there and then in 1704, but the entire history of Europe in the 18th century would have looked very, very different. First of all, Louis XIV and France become even more dominant. You then don't get the rise of Prussia in the 18th century. What happens with Austria? Vienna almost certainly falls. And then do the Ottoman Empire think, hello, we sense an opportunity here. We're going to drive into the remnants of Austria. Do they then have a conflict with France themselves? What happens to England and Britain? Probably don't end up with Gibraltar. But also, do they get access to the same territories in the Americas that they eventually do when the settlement at the end of the War of Spanish Succession is reached? And what about some of the other long-term consequences had the Battle of Blenheim played out differently? You don't get the legacy, the military genius of the Duke of Marlborough. You don't get him being gifted Blenheim Palace as a result of his success. And who was born in Blenheim Palace? A couple of centuries later, Winston Churchill. Does his life play out in the same way if he's not raised in such a gilded upbringing? Some really interesting long-term consequences, all stemming from one battle in 1704. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Andrew and Chris for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone on YouTube. And don't forget, you can now also listen to History Undone wherever you get your podcasts. That's it from us. Goodbye.